You're listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks, your source for centered and focused play therapy coaching.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brenna Hicks, the Kid Counselor, and this is the Play Therapy Podcast where you get a master class in child-centered play therapy and practical support and application for your work with children and their families. In today's episode, I am answering a question from Beth in Wales, and she has been working with a child with complex needs, a history of trauma, so kind of a rough start. And she was actively conducting play therapy, and they yanked the child from treatment. And there were some concerns raised about play therapy and it not working and it actually causing more harm than good. So I want to read you a little bit from her email, and then I want to share some thoughts about what is going on and how we handle situations like that, because inevitably the longer you do this for any length of time, you will end up with a family for a variety of reasons saying that they're pulling the kid prematurely and it's not working, it's making things worse, they're increasing in this or that, or they have some rationale for why this isn't going to work. And they're actually concerned that it's doing more harm than good sometimes. So I think that's the scenario here. So I want to read a little bit from her email and then we'll talk about it together. So she says that the person who has parental rights claims that the non-directive approach has allowed the child to translate his aggressive feelings from the playroom into his home life and was behaving so badly that the foster caregiver was no longer able to care for him. So then Beth says, I felt equipped and educated to reformulate a therapeutic plan with the team. I also read Crenshaw's book, who said, quote, children quickly recognize the difference between the special play therapy circumstances and conditions in real life, end quote. That is a very similar quote to what Landreth says, so there's continuity there. And then plus within the therapeutic space, the child understands the boundaries, but the social worker dismissed it completely. So then she moves on to her question. So my question to you is, what evidence is there that could help me further understand a child's ability to process and understand the use of aggressive play in the therapy setting, and what happens if they become more aggressive at home? I worked with everyone in the beginning and explained things could get worse before they get better, and that this is a normal part of the process. I would appreciate your response. So Beth from Wales, thank you so much for reaching out. I'm sorry that this turned into kind of a difficult scenario, and obviously, my heart goes out to the little boy who obviously desperately needs play therapy, and so it's too bad that there's no support from other people in his life. So let's dive into some of these components here. So aggressive toys, aggressive play. I did an episode recently about, actually I've done several because a lot of questions that I get are about aggression in some way, shape, or form. So we understand the value of aggressive toys and the category of acting out aggressive toys in a child-centered playroom. We understand how to articulate to parents and caregivers the value of aggressive play. So these are all things we've covered in the past. But specifically, aggression in the playroom is not negative. And aggression in the real world is almost always viewed negatively. But aggression in the playroom is healthy and normal and appropriate. So we have a huge gap in the way the world perceives aggression and the way we perceive progression. So when we're thinking about this in terms of communicating this to other people, it doesn't even make sense to try to get people on board with the value of aggression because they're not going to agree. A school is going to have a no aggression policy. Parents with younger children in the home are going to have a no aggression policy. There's really no getting around that. So I think that's a really helpful place to begin. We understand how valuable it is for the child and how necessary it is, but we just need to understand that quietly and not necessarily convince anyone else that they should be playing aggressively. They're not going to understand. However, the premise that kids can get worse before they get better, that is extremely important for everyone in the child's life to know. Because you can't have expectations that are unrealistic. Most people think, well, if I start therapy, things are going to get better because therapy is helpful and therapy is good. And for an adult that sits down and talks, that almost is always the case, right? Because you're dealing with your junk internally. But children externalize their junk. So let's go back to an early episode where I shared the quote that a child's worst behaviors are really just clues into where they're hurting, right? So if a child comes in and beats the crap out of Bobo, or slices your neck off with the sword, or stabs you 87 times and says that you're bleeding, and they, are doing all of these really, really deep, meaningful, heavy play themes, it's a clue into where they're hurting. So if a child comes in and plays aggressively, it's necessary, but does it mean that sometimes their behavior outside of the playroom is going to get worse before it gets better? Yes, but we have to be able to articulate the why. Therapy isn't making them worse. Aggression isn't making them worse. What they're doing in the playroom is not making them worse. What is making them worse is their dysregulation. What is making them worse is their lack of coping, their lack of emotional vocabulary, their lack of self-control. Because you ignore and avoid the junk in your life until you can't anymore. Well, a playroom is the place where you can't ignore your junk. So when you come in, all of this stuff you've been stuffing down starts to bubble up to the surface. And it's overwhelming and dysregulatory. So we have to be able to help people understand they are not getting worse because of what they're playing in the playroom. A child could come in and color every day, and they could still have worse behavior at home because therapy is hard, and therapy forces you to deal with the muck that you're carrying around. And therapy forces you to deal with emotions that you've been trying to ignore and avoid for sometimes years. This little boy has trauma, complex needs, and a history of trauma. How much has he been carrying around? So when therapy starts to stir the pot, yes, sometimes behavior gets worse before it gets better, but it is not therapy that is the problem. It is not the toys he's playing with that's the problem. It is not aggressive play that is the problem. It is the therapeutic process that is stirring up all of this stuff, and they get dysregulated. And dysregulated kids act badly. And I say badly, air quote, because no child is ever bad, but sometimes behavior is not accepted. So I'm not saying the child is being bad. I'm saying the behavior is not self-enhancing, right? So all of a sudden you have caregivers and parents that don't understand this. They're not prepared for the shift, and they do see a worsening, and they're like, okay, this isn't working. Actually, this is making everything worse. I'm done. All right. So the worse before it gets better is a really, really important piece of this. Secondly, yes, 100% kids know that the rules are different in the playroom than they are at home. They do not expect the same level of permissiveness at home that they get in the playroom. They do not expect to be able to do the things in the home or at school or anywhere else outside of the playroom that they get to do therapeutically. They know there's a difference. Grant in fantasy what you can't grant in reality. One of our rules of thumb, right? Because in the playroom, we can grant their fantasies. If they want to stab a baby to death in the playroom, they can do it. They're not going to stab a baby to death in real life. They know that the rules are different. Reality and fantasy do not converge in a child's mind. And, Beth, you mentioned Crenshaw's book. Landreth talks about the same thing. There is plenty of evidence that shows children understand the rules are different. It's no different than a child that knows that at karate, the sensei expects XYZ. At school, the teacher expects XYZ. At home, mom and dad expect XYZ. They understand the difference in environments and rules and expectations. So there is no negative carryover for having a permissive environment, a child-led, child-centered environment in the playroom, and that's somehow going to thwart everything in the child's life in any other situation. It's just not supported through research. And then finally, here's a really helpful illustration that I use a lot with parents and with my therapists that I train, and just kind of anyone that really needs a better understanding of the play therapy process. Here's what happens. A child gets stuck on one end of a pendulum. So if the child has felt powerless, for example, for a length of time, they imagine a pendulum that swings left to right. So let's say that the powerless side of the pendulum is left justified, okay? So imagine the pendulum swinging all the way to the left and getting stuck there. It gets hung up on something. So in the child's mind, the pendulum has been stuck in a powerless state. Well, in a child's mind, the only way to get unstuck is to swing to the complete opposite side of the pendulum. So in the playroom, when they're afforded the opportunity to do so, they will take dictatorial power. They will take authoritarian power. They want all of the control because they think that that is the antidote to the powerlessness state that they've been stuck in. So they went from left justified pendulum and they swung it all the way over to right justified pendulum, where now I want all the control and power all the time and I don't care. Okay? But here's the beauty of the child-centered process. Here's the beauty of the playroom. The child realizes, actually, I don't like this either. I didn't like having no power, but I don't like having all the power either. And eventually they learn that center, meaning at the bottom of the U-shaped pendulum curve, is balance. And health and happiness is found in the calm, centered balance of the middle. So I don't want to have no power, but I also don't want to have all the power. So I need to find middle ground. But here's what happens, unfortunately. When a child is swinging to the other side, they've never been in that space before. So let's go with the power, right? So a child has felt powerless. They've never felt power before. Once they get there, they don't know what to do with it. So even though they're sorting out and working through and healing and growing and changing, what comes off is really, really defiant, dictatorial, power-hungry kids. But it's just because they've never been in that role before. So when I'm listening to you, Beth, talk about this little boy who was starting to play aggressively, he'd never been given the opportunity to channel emotions in that way. He'd never had the place or the environment or the support or the opportunity to get all of this stuff out. So you get all of it out. Sometimes you don't know how to handle it. You know, you'll get super, super anxious kids that are like scared to death of getting in trouble. So they're like the air quote, perfect children. And so parents will bring them in and say, I mean, we have no behavior problems with them. Like they are just like the ideal kid behaviorally, but their anxiety levels are through the roof. So we work on anxiety levels. Inevitably, what do you think happens? 15 or so weeks in, parents are going, they're really becoming mouthy. They're really starting to like raise their voice when they don't like something. They're starting to like not want to do things. And like, it's actually like something I've never seen before in this kid. Like my other kids are like that, not this kid. And I'm constantly saying to parents, we uncovered the stuff that was holding all of that down. We got rid of some levels of anxiety. And now your child realizes that they have a feeling that they want to share. They have a thought they want to share. They're willing to say no when they're not okay with something, but they're not used to it. They're not good at it. They've never, ever practiced refusing or rebutting or, having any kind of disagreement whatsoever. So if it comes across as really snotty at first, it's because they really have no practice doing this. Give them a little while and they'll find center. And then by the next consultation, they're like, yep, you're exactly right. That's exactly what happened. They're expressing themselves now, but it's in a respectful way. And it's the pendulum swing, right? So we go from one extreme to the other. We don't really like either one. We don't know how to handle either one, but eventually we find the middle ground. So if there's an escalation of behavior at home, it's okay. You just have to help them understand why. You have to give them tools to deal with it appropriately, which is where your advocacy comes in, right? So you need to explain how to set limits effectively. You need to explain how to give choices. You need to explain how to reflect feelings. This falls on us to help them cope with the change in behavior. And then we wait it out, and through therapy and through time, it all sorts itself out. So Beth, I hope you find that helpful. I hope the Play Therapy Podcast family finds that helpful. We will inevitably be faced with kids whose family members, caregivers, whomever is bringing them, they just don't think that it's working. They don't think that we're going in the right direction, and we need to be able to handle that well. So Beth, thank you so much for reaching out. And as always, I'm so grateful to have you as part of the Play Therapy Podcast family. We'll talk again soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks. For more episodes and resources, please go to www.playtherapypodcast.com.